Welcome to the Divine Identity Podcast. In this video, we're looking at Igor's article, What If John Was Not Borrowing from Philo? So, one of the most common, almost unquestioned assumptions in biblical studies is that when the Apostle John wrote his famous prologue, saying, "In the beginning was the Word," or the Logos, he was heavily influenced by the Greek-educated Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria. Because Philo used the term logos before John did, we've basically been trained to approach John chapter 1 through the lens of Greek philosophy first. It's like we treat Philo as this hidden authority, pulling the strings behind the text.
But man, that raises a massive question for us today. Was John actually borrowing his theology from Philo? I mean, just because Philo used logos first, does that automatically make him the controlling lens for John's gospel? Or is there a better scripture-first lens we should be using instead? What if John is entirely drawing from the rich, deep well of the Old Testament, rather than the philosophical world of Alexandria?
Okay, let's dive right into this, because the contrast here is honestly pretty striking. When you read John through Philo, the Logos functions as this heavenly intermediary, kind of like a philosophical bridge between a remote, distant God and the created world. And honestly, that easily turns the Word into a second divine power. But think about it. John doesn't begin his gospel with, "In Philo was the Logos," right? He begins with, "In the beginning." John's Logos is rooted firmly in the Genesis creation account, where God definitely does not need an independent intermediary. God himself creates directly through his own communicative reality.
So here is our roadmap for this explainer. 1. Genesis, not Alexandria. 2. The biblical creation pattern. 3. Words, breath, and spirit. 4. Defining revelatory designators. 5. Aspectival monotheism explained. And finally, 6, identifying John's logos.
All right, kicking things off with section 1, Genesis, not Alexandria.
Let's start right at the foundation. In the beginning. This phrase is absolutely not accidental. It's a direct, intentional echo of Genesis 1:1. John actually wants the very first page of Scripture to frame his prologue. In Genesis, there is no philosophical intermediary standing between God and creation. God simply speaks. He says, "Let there be light," and boom, there is light. The creation of the world happens because God's speech goes forth. God is acting through his own word.
Moving on to section 2, the biblical creation pattern. And this brilliantly illustrates our next point. To prove that John is talking about the literal creation of the universe, and not just, say, the beginning of Jesus' earthly ministry, we really have to look at the specific language he uses. He writes, "All things came into being through him." Now, in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament that was widely used in John's day, Genesis 1 repeatedly uses forms of the Greek word ginomai to describe creation. God speaks, and things come to be. John is taking that exact creation pattern and carrying it forward here. All things literally came into being through the Word. Which brings us to section 3, words, breath, and spirit. See, creating by the Word is not some brand new philosophical concept that John had to just invent out of thin air. It is a deeply established scriptural theme. Let's look at how this builds across the Old Testament. Step 1 is Genesis. God acts by simply speaking and creation comes to be. Step 2 slows that process down a bit in Psalm 33:6, specifically naming word, breath, and mouth. Step 3 goes even deeper in 2 Samuel 22:16, bringing together a rebuke, a breath blast, spirit, and nostrils. And step 4 in Job 33:4 confirms the Spirit of God and breath giving life. What's happening here is Scripture is progressively revealing that divine speech has a source, a power, and an expression. It layers these realities over time. Let's actually break down 2 Samuel 22:16, because honestly, it carries incredible weight. First, we see the rebuke of the Lord. That is the spoken act. Then the breath blast, which is the outward breath expression. His spirit is the inner divine reality. The nostrils point to the source designator. And the Lord is the personal acting subject. This verse is absolutely crucial because it's showing us this profound distinction within the one living God, but without any division whatsoever. We are not talking about 3 separate agents or detachable parts here. It is one God acting through his own living reality. All right, section 4, defining revelatory designators. Now, to really understand terms like nostrils or mouth without falling into, bizarre extremes, we need the right theological vocabulary. When Scripture says God has a mouth or nostrils, It's obviously not talking about physical flesh, right? God is spirit. But here is the absolute key. It's also not meaningless, empty poetry. If it were just poetry, God's revelation would essentially have no real substance behind it. So, what are they? These terms are revelatory designators. They point to real, functioning, distinguishable aspects of God's self-revealed life, but translated into language that we creatures can actually comprehend.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how beautifully these scriptural terms organize into three ordered categories from Igor's article. First, you have the real aspects, soul, form, and spirit. Second, the source designators, mouth, nostrils, face, and hand, which point to the functions of his living structure. And third, the preceding expressions, word, rebuke, voice, and breath. This exact framework is a total game changer. It keeps us from flattening scripture into mere metaphor, and at the same time, it stops us from multiplying God into separate, detached parts.
Moving right along to Section 5, Aspectival Monotheism Explained. This ordered framework leads us straight to the theological climax, revealing the true nature of God's structure as given in the text, aspectival monotheism. Let's define this really clearly. Aspectival monotheism affirms that the one God is a unified spirit being, but Scripture reveals real distinctions within him. Now listen closely to this because it's super important. An aspect is not a part. God isn't assembled from pieces like a puzzle. It is not a mode because he isn't just switching masks. It is not merely an expression, and it is definitely not a separate agent. God himself always remains the sole acting subject. And Scripture actually names God's living structure explicitly. It calls it his form. Think about Numbers 12:8, where Moses beheld the form of the Lord, or Philippians 2:6, which speaks of the form of God. God's form is his own uncreated spiritual body. It's the real aspect through which he actually reveals himself to creation.
And finally, Section 6, Identifying John's Logos.
So we are finally ready to synthesize all of this Old Testament theology back to John chapter 1. And the comparison here is key. Think about it. A spoken word, in everyday human terms, is really just a passing audible sound. But a passing sound can't be with God and was God, like John 1:1 claims, right? So why does John use word instead of a more static term? Because John's prologue is all about God's outgoing, creative, and revelatory movement. God speaks, creation comes to be, life is given, and light shines. John is using word as a revelatory designator. It points directly to the active, outgoing movement of the living divine source reality from which God's speech proceeds. And guess what? Jesus himself completely validates this reading. In John 5:37 and 38, Jesus tells the religious leaders, "You have never heard his voice or seen his form, and his word does not remain in you." I mean, wow. Notice how beautifully Jesus connects the Father's voice, the Father's form, and the Father's word, all in the exact same revelatory field. This just proves that John is fully relying on this rich biblical pattern, not on Philo's philosophy. So the crucial point is this. John's logos is Scripture's revelatory designator for God's own form. The Word is God's living, personal structure and creative and revelatory action. The Word is not a second God. It is definitely not a Philonic intermediary. It is God's own self-revealed reality, while God himself, the living divine I, remains the one acting subject. It's truly amazing when you look at it this way.
Now, you might be sitting there thinking about John 1:14, where it says the Word became flesh. And yes, that is absolutely central, but it's really the next stage of the discussion. See, while John 1:3 is about macro creation, the whole universe coming into being, John 1:14 moves us into biblical anthropology and the Genesis 2:7 pattern of human emergence. But before we could ever hope to understand the flesh, we first had to correctly identify the Word.
The bottom line is, John didn't need Philo to explain the word. Scripture already gave him the entire world, the language and the categories for understanding it. So I want to leave you with this to chew on. If John's logos isn't some Greek intermediary, but is actually God's own form in creative action, how does this Scripture-first lens completely change your understanding of the incarnation? Think about what it really means for that word to become flesh. Thanks for diving into this explainer with me, and I'll catch you next time.